Hello, and welcome to session 2 of our 4-part series, Elevating UDL for Every Learner. My name is Janelle Mercado, Project Coordinator for Supporting Inclusive Practices from El Dorado County Office of Education. And co-hosting this series with me is our wonderful program specialist, Juliet. Introduce yourself.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Juliet Nyanwu, and I'm a program support specialist with SIP, and I'm also out of El Dorado County Office of Education. Happy to be here with you all. You are in for a treat.
And on behalf of our team, we'd like to thank you all for being here today. For those who are able to join us in session 1, welcome back. For those that are here for the first time in session 2, like Juliet said, you're in for a treat, and we hope that this will be a wonderful experience for you. If you did miss session 1, we already have the recording on the resource Padlet. You can also find a certificate of completion on our resource Padlet for attendance of session 1 or any of the other sessions that you're able to attend. Today's presentation will also be recorded, and as soon as we can get that posted on the Padlet, it will be there. So we've also enabled closed captioning, so please access it as needed. Our team is here to support you, and we will be hosting a Q&A at the end of today's session. So please enter any questions that come up for you in the Q&A function or in the chat. We'll start collecting them as we go throughout the session. And with that, I am going to turn it over to our wonderful presenters, Nicole Tucker Smith and Sylvia Rodriguez.
Hello, welcome everyone. Sylvia, go ahead, you go first.
Okay. Welcome, everyone. Happy Tuesday afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us at the end of what I know is probably a long and hard day of educating and being a part of our learners' lives. So just thank you for joining us and making this space. My name is Dr. Sylvia Rodriguez Douglas. I'm the VP of Inclusive Services at Lessoncast. And you'll really see me today in the chat answering questions and kind of playing a supportive role to help facilitate today's conversation. I may chime in here and there, but really I'm so excited to turn it over to someone that needs no introduction, but I'm going to turn it over to her to introduce herself anyway. Nicole, take it away.
Hi, everyone. Yes, I am Nicole Tucker Smith. I am presenting from Baltimore, Maryland. I'm so excited to be sharing session 2 with you as part of this series. We are focusing today, yes, on elevating UDL for every learner, but specifically we're talking about engagement that cultivates belonging. And I am the CEO of Lessoncast, and I'm so excited to have my team member here with me. Really, we focus on, at Lessoncast, we focus on putting inclusive education, professional learning into classroom practice. So many times professional learning stays in the learning box and doesn't make it to the practice box and actually impacting in a positive way changes in the classroom. So I'm just really excited to be here with you. And your materials for today's session are available on, and if somebody could put the bit.ly link for, it's not that one in there, the bit.ly link for our materials today. It is also on the Padlet of resources, and there will be several resources that I'll reference in our conversation today. And this is the same, actually it's the same Google Doc as the last time we were together. So a week ago, we had session 1. I've just now added materials for session 2. So let me take a look and pause, make sure everyone has access to this. See if there's anything in the chat. All right. Okay. All right, so everyone make sure you can get to the materials for today. Our goal for this series is to offer concrete steps, things you can do tomorrow, considerations and resources to leverage UDL 3.0 in designing equitable environments so that every learner can thrive, And as we have this conversation about UDL 3.0, we're reminded that the UDL guidelines were updated this past summer, 2024, This current version is called the 3.0 version of the UDL guidelines. And one of the key signs that you're looking at the updated version is that the goal at the top has been updated from expert learning to learner agency. So on our session last week, we talked about the goal of UDL being learner agency that is purposeful and reflective, resourceful and authentic, strategic and action oriented. Today, as we talk about engagement that cultivates belonging, we're looking at this principle that is often color-coded in green: design multiple means of engagement. Design multiple means of engagement. And because we only have an hour together, our focus is going to be how can we leverage the UDL guidelines to design engagement that cultivates belonging, multiple means of engagement in order to cultivate belonging. And so as we think about this conversation today, I want to ground us in this question: what does belonging mean to you? And I'm going to take a moment to stop talking, pause, and if you want to share in the chat, go ahead. What does belonging mean to you?
Nicole, they are coming in fast and furious. I love it.
Yes, we'll give it a few more seconds. I'm seeing so much about connection and community and acceptance and safety. Yay! And knowing that my voice matters. I'm a valued contributor, being seen and heard. Also noting being able to express yourself without judgment. Several people mentioned without judgment. Anything that you want to share, Sylvia? What does belonging mean to you?
You know, I saw this in the chat and it really resonated with me. Someone said, not feeling like you have to change yourself in order to fit in, right? You're just accepted for who you are and what you come with.
Yes, yes, and I love that. And another way that we think about this, so being able to show up as your authentic self, not having to change in order to fit some predetermined mold of what is acceptable. Here's one way we think about belonging in our work at Lessoncast, where belonging is somewhere I want to be and where they want me to. Right? I want to be there. I feel connected and they want me to, not me pretending to be somebody else, but me being able to show up as my authentic self and being able to navigate and engage in the space. Now, both of those parts are important. Somewhere I want to be is important. And knowing that and feeling, I should say, that they want me to is important. And when we think about this idea of belonging, it's essential. It's essential. It's part of, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, whether or not you agree with this order in particular, but love and belonging really is a sense of connection. And it is a required human need. And it's a required feeling, really, in order to have effective engagement in the learning environment. So here is where we need to think for a moment, and we're going to apply the UDL core idea of remembering that barriers are in the environment, not the learner. And so almost pretty much every school I've ever worked with, every school, every district has said, we want students to feel like they belong. But here's the thing. In many cases, schools belong, they're part of the community, right? Students might even walk to school, right? They're not far. And the teachers are the ones who might drive from a distance to the school. So why would it be that students feel like they don't belong in their own school community? And so we have to take a moment, recognizing it. We're not saying that there's a problem with the student if they feel like they don't belong. We have to think about what is in the environment. So my next question for us is, and let's just take a moment to reflect. We're not trying to sit in guilt or point fingers, but we're just thinking, how and when do schools make students feel like they don't belong? Have you ever observed this? That schools make students feel like, are there any ways in which schools may operate that might make students feel like they don't belong? Take a moment. If you want to add in the chat, let's think about this question. So many things, and it's actually a really wide array. I'm trying to keep up. Which ones really stand out to you, Sylvia? There's a couple I was going to highlight.
Yeah, I think I'm seeing some direct quotes, and language is so powerful and always stands out to me. So when I see some quotes like a teacher said he destroyed my Kleenex box, I have no idea what was going on in that situation, but it sounds like there was a lot more going on, and that a student felt othered or blamed for something that maybe just was not really appropriately addressed, and the behavior was not, you don't have the grades to get in this class, or these are my students and those are your students, right? So I'm seeing some powerful language around, that just cues to learners that this is not a space for them.
Right. Another common one I see is when there's only one way, and then if you can't fit that way, whether it's in an English language arts class or whether it's in a physical education class, then it's like you don't belong here. Yeah, not being included due to having a disability, because there's no option that you are able to participate. Oh, when your contributions are dismissed.
Right. Or the SPED kids, even calling them, I used to work in a school where we used to say the IEP kids, right? The kids with IEP.
Mm-hmm,
Hmm.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, and somebody mentioned about Dr. Bettina Love, reminded that Ruby Bridges is only 65 years old. Like, because somebody mentioned earlier, like historical exclusion. So, like, just to put it into context, my parents went to segregated schools. My parents went to through college. They had to go to segregated schools. Like, this is not far away, right? This is something that is in our immediate past.
Right. We're
And
still
so,
grappling with the
mhm.
legacy of that, right? Mm.
And yeah, and let's build on this. That's the idea of language matters. Language matters. So even when, and some people mention this in the chat, when we say things like these students can't, these students don't belong here, right? That language creates a sense of who doesn't belong. Here's some other implicit messages. Other implicit messages that some students don't belong. Again, the language. Those students are your students. So if you're working in an inclusion classroom and a general educator or somebody else said those students, your students, that's a message that you're not talking about our students. Also, rewarding engagement or participation that only fits in a specific mold. One that often comes up is either mispronouncing. So when we talk about multiple ethnicities and cultures, and that's going to lead to different names that may be unfamiliar. So mispronouncing or calling students by the wrong name. I will never forget, my daughter had a second grade teacher who continuously called her every other Black girl's name. And there was only 5 of them. Like, but it was never her. And it was the idea of they're all interchangeable, right? It's not even worth learning your name properly. Or here's one that we might not think about, especially for supporting students with disabilities: actively avoiding identity in conversation. Actively avoiding identity. And an example of that is being afraid to use terms related to disability. There's a movement called Say the Word, and I put an article in the resources. It says, the article is titled Say the Word, and it's part of the disability movement to reclaim the idea of disability and recognize that disability is not a bad word. And in many cases, it's a way that people may identify. And so some of us were trained in people first language, but there's also a movement towards identity first language, and recognizing that identity is something that we shouldn't have to hide. And when we actively avoid it, it kind of signals that maybe we don't want to talk about it because it makes us feel uncomfortable. And this article that I included in there does a really good job of talking about why people might avoid talking about disability, because it makes them feel uncomfortable, and how that sends the message of, you're actually not comfortable with me. And then also, when we think about supporting students with disabilities, I've seen this where you're treating a student, or somebody might be treating a student's presence in the classroom as a privilege, and not a right. Like, well, I let you here. So, the most is to not disturb everybody else, right? And so I know that this group has done work with rightful presence. Thank you, team. And that idea of, you're not doing me a favor by letting me be here. I have a right to be here. And that article that I mentioned, I wanted to highlight. There's a quote in the article, Say the Word, that talks about how embracing the word disability and normalizing it as an aspect of identity has the potential to lead to positive psychological health outcomes, including feelings of belonging. And so that's something to consider when we talk about language, but also just not actively avoiding language related to identity. And so as we think about some of these barriers, now let's talk about how do we bust them. How might UDL 3.0 help to bust these barriers? Well, before we get into specifics around the guidelines, I want to share with you a study that really helps to highlight and I think illustrate this idea of the power of belonging. And so the study relates to, they call it the question of belonging. And it was a research study first conducted in 2007. I think it was actually first published, I should say, in 2007 in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. And in this study, they talked about this experiment, really, where researchers were working with college students, so freshman college students, and they provided the subjects who were participating with statistics, quotations, well, I should say in the variable group, with statistics, quotations, and stories from upperclassmen about their experiences. And so these statistics and quotes and stories were all about overcoming struggle. And so there were stories about how they struggled at first, but eventually got through it. And after kind of some of that priming, they asked the subjects to use that information to write about getting through their own difficulties and how it gets better. So the freshman students, they're away from home, studies might be getting more difficult and challenging. So they're asked, write a letter to someone like you in your position right now for next year. So next year's freshmen, think of someone like you. What would you tell them about how you may have struggled and what you did to get to the other side? And so these participants are believing that they're writing to the next generation of incoming freshmen. So this is an audience that they care about, they can relate to. They're probably picturing themselves as they're writing it. And they're reflecting and writing about their own experiences. And as they go through this process, they're able to put whatever difficulties they may have into a story, right? It has a beginning, middle, and ultimately an end, right? Even though they're not done, they're still in freshman year. And this intervention had positive effects, not just for that first year, but through 4 years afterwards, in terms of higher completion, higher grades, academic performance, attendance. And it had the greatest positive effect on groups that were most likely to be marginalized. So students who identified as people of color, and then also women who were in studies or majors that were primarily dominated by men, right? So they may have felt more marginalized in that space. And so one of the things this shows is that these students were encouraged to recognize the power of overcoming, and also recognize that just because they struggle, they're not alone. That even though they were telling their own story, they were learning from others and telling their own story, and they learned that they're not alone in the struggle. And so if we break down this research study and look at it through the lens of UDL 3.0, there's a couple of things they did here. Belonging through storytelling. So if we look at this guideline here, welcoming interests and identities, one of the things they did was they said, tell your story to someone like you. That's a beautiful way that we often don't think about welcoming interests and identities. Tell your story to someone like you. And then when it comes to sustaining effort and persistence, they highlighted lived examples of overcoming. So they brought in statistics and data and stories from others who'd been where they are and made it to the other side. And then when we think about this third guideline here, design options for emotional capacity, the practice of storytelling in this way was used as a reflection activity for emotional capacity, allowed the participants to frame adversity as a common human challenge rather than a deficit. So many times we frame learning as something you're supposed to get the first time, rather than recognizing that learning is a process, and that when we struggle, productive struggle is a good thing. And it is a common human challenge rather than a deficit, rather than there's something wrong with me or there's something wrong with people like me. And so we're going to take some other examples. We're really going to break down this principle of designing multiple means of engagement and how we can, in our classrooms, cultivate this sense of belonging, because this sense of belonging is so powerful. It is so powerful. I was working with some educators last year because they were having lots of issues around chronic absenteeism. And I'm looking at all the strategies that are coming out, what you're supposed to do for chronic absenteeism. And I'm like, you know what? I've been there, done that. Those strategies are not going to work. In a lot of these cases, you have a belonging problem. Yes, it's chronic absenteeism, but you have a belonging problem. And then, one of the participants said, well, let me just push back on that. You really think some of these students aren't coming? Some of these students aren't coming because they don't feel like they belong. And I was like, well, I don't know your students personally, but I do know that a strong sense of belonging will pull them to school when other things are challenging in their lives. So, the educators wanted to blame it on other things and home life and everything else. And I'm like, but I know that even when things are challenging, a strong sense of belonging will pull you to school. I have seen third graders take multiple buses in the rain to get to school because they wanted to be there and they knew they wanted them to. So let's look at how we can create this sense of belonging rather than looking at punitive measures like, oh, I'm going to take you to chronic absenteeism court, which is what we had to do when I was an assistant principal. So one thing that we can do to cultivate a sense of belonging is to make space for students' interests. A lot of classrooms are so filled up with the things that the teachers are interested in. Where is there space for students' interests? And this relates directly to Guideline 7, Welcoming Interests and Identities. And there's lots of interest inventories out there. One that you may have heard me talk about before, if you've seen some of my other presentations, is where I would have students, we had, you can do this digitally or on paper. They had a heart, and on the inside of the heart, they recorded, these are all the things that I care about. And on the outside of the heart, they recorded, these are all the things I'm concerned about. I used it as a pre-writing strategy because I wanted them to brainstorm topics, but I also used it as a way to, gain insight in terms of what do they care about? What are they concerned about? And the concerned about were things like if I wanted to change something in the world, like I'm concerned about climate change, or I'm concerned about, something that's going on in my community or something that's happening at school. And then I care about are things that are really, really important to me. And even though they were using this as a pre-writing strategy, I used it to help make connections throughout our time together. So I would, something was in the lesson, one of the lessons, I would refer to this. Somebody liked Taekwondo, I'd mention it in a lesson, and they would be like, "How do you know I like Taekwondo?" But you're just making space. You're making a concerted effort to connect to students' interests and identities. So another way that we can increase this sense of belonging is to, a lot of times we think about check-ins. Okay, so I don't know how many of you out there do check-ins. A lot of people do check-ins or some kind of greeting or check-in with students. And I want to suggest that we should consider check-ins with choice. How do we offer check-ins with choice? And let me give you an example of what I mean by this. So I was in a classroom and the students, everybody had to do a check-in. And when they did the check-in, everybody did it on the computer. And then even though they were submitted anonymously, the teacher, kind of went through all of the check-ins and showed them. And one of the students had said in their check-in, it was Monday morning, they said, "I don't want to be here." They're like, "Honestly, TBH, as they say, TBH, I don't want to be here." And the teacher was kind of surprised by this response and said, "Oh, I'm so sorry you feel that way." And here's the thing. I'm sure that exchange did not make them feel better about being there. One of the worst things that we can do is apologize for somebody's feelings, right? You don't want to say, "I'm sorry you feel that way." That's kind of an insult. And so when we think about check-ins, it's not, all check-ins aren't equal. And we need to think about, where do students have choice and autonomy even in a check-in? Because let's think about the goal. Let's apply this principle of clear goals, flexible means, right? Clear goals, flexible means. So in this idea of clear goals, flexible means, what is the goal of a check-in? What is the goal? The goal is to get a sense of how students are feeling, right? Create a space where if they need to say something to you, they can. It's a place to help them get ready and prepared to learn, right? So if that's the goal, how can we be flexible? Well, students can choose whether or not to share. That should be an option in a check-in, right? You can choose whether or not to share. You can choose how to share. You can choose what to share. And so when we think about even that moment of check-in, which is designed to build connection, how we do it matters. How are we offering choice and flexibility for our learners, even in that check-in moment? Now I'm going to pause, Sylvia. I know I've seen some things in the chat. I don't know if we have, I know we're going to do questions before, but I don't want to get anyone to get stuck in a question.
No, that just a lot of sort of agreement, a lot of folks resonating with what you were saying. One thing that I thought was such a great example to add to a way that we may unintentionally make students not feel welcomed is misgendering a student, in addition to maybe saying the name wrong or confusing a name with another student's name. We do have a question. What about students who don't want to engage or participate? What do we do then?
Well, many times choosing not to engage or participate often is due to lack of flexibility. Oftentimes it's due to inflexibility, where they don't feel like they have a choice. And when you don't feel like you have a choice, your only choice is to do it or not do it. Right? So if you're going to exercise your agency by choosing not to do it. So in many cases, we can think about where's flexibility, but then also if a student is opting not to participate, I often am an advocate for having a conversation with that student as to why, right? You can, and maybe not in the moment and definitely not in front of everybody else, but there's an opportunity. There's a resource that there's a book called Smart but there's a whole series called Smart but Scattered. And, even though I don't like to use the term smart students or whatever, but it's a very good book on executive functioning. And there's a section in there on task initiation. And it's like 100 reasons why not to start a task. Like I did, and it'll be reasons like I didn't see the purpose. I did this already. I don't want to. Like there's all these, I don't see the value in it, right? There's so many reasons, or I forgot. It really wasn't that important to me, right? And so sometimes it's having a conversation, because we can be making judgments about why they're not participating or engaging, when they might actually be able to answer those questions for us.
Right. And I think Nicole and I, we talk a lot about how all behavior is a form of communication. So, right, the root cause of why that student is not engaging or participating is something worth investigating with the student, if they're able to kind of dig with you and kind of get to what might be getting in the way. What is the barrier? Is it lack of relevance? Is it lack of interest? Is it I already did this last year and I feel already really competent in it? There's so many possible reasons, as Nicole listed. So it's worth doing a little research.
Yeah, and even students who say, I'm there so my parents don't go to truancy court. That's real. I've had that.
Mm-hmm.
And, and then and that's where part of it is building relationships and understanding, well, what do you enjoy? What do you enjoy? Or what might might make this a more engaging or pleasant experience for you? And this is the thing, belonging and relationship do not happen overnight, because students have to gain a sense that I trust you, and trust takes time. I know Zaretta Hammond has trust generators, if you look that up. In culturally responsive teaching, I think it's in culturally responsive teaching the brain, but what are ways that we can help foster trust, because they're not going to just change their mind about you overnight. So let's keep building on this idea of sort of making space for students' interests. We're offering check-ins with a choice. Okay? Offering check-ins with a choice. Let me move this out the way here. And if we, and this actually might get to that question about, like, this student says, I'm only here because of truancy court. So if you take a look at Guidelines 3.0, the third bullet under welcoming interests and identities is nurture, joy, and play. Sometimes I'll sit in classrooms like, well, I don't really want to be here either, because we're making everything so serious. Yes, learning is serious. Learning can also include joy and play. And in fact, you need it. And so let's talk about the neuroscience a little bit. Why do we need joy and play? Well, when we're learning, and now joy doesn't mean I'm just laughing all the time. It doesn't mean, it's not even an equivalent to being happy, but it does connect to this sense of purpose and value. And it's a time when information flows more freely. When we're feeling joyful, you can actually be going through a lot of struggle and joy at the same time. So information flows freely. Learners are able to retain more when they're learning with joy. It improves social connections. So a student who says, I don't want to be here, I would be willing to guess that they're not experiencing a lot of joy in school. And so when we have learning without joy, here's the cost. Here's the cost of learning without joy. It affects information processing. Like, literally, our ability to understand and process information is affected when we have learning without joy. And it impacts our long-term memory storage. So students might be able to cram for the moment, cram for the quiz, but learning without joy will not support long-term memory storage. And if you want to understand a little bit more deeply what joy is, so there is an article in your materials all about 5 strategies that you can use to increase joy in the classroom. And in the article, there's a quote to help define this, what we mean by the sense of joy. It's a distinct, specific emotion that causes the release of 2 types of neurotransmitters in the brain: dopamine and serotonin. So joy is directly connected to learning and the brain. And it's these chemical messengers that cause us to smile, laugh, or even jump for joy. And it's essential to learning at every age, not just for children. It's for adults too. There's a lot of research in there about, research out there, I should say, about how educators are leaving because of lack of joy. You know, we get into education to make a difference. And when we feel like we're not making a difference, we are disconnected from that sense of purpose. And we start to lose our joy too. And so it's important at every age. And when you bring joy into the classroom, even if your focus is, I want to make this a joyful place for students, you feel good too. You feel good too. So there are some, I encourage you to take a look at that article, but just to highlight some of the tips that they share, and they give specific examples, but some tips for bringing joy into the classroom. One is to employ a sense of discovery. Somebody mentioned when we make students feel like they don't belong, when we feel like we have to cover so much information. We just got to get through the content, get through the content. Learners definitely aren't going to feel a sense of joy there. In fact, when we feel like we have to cover, instead, what we need to do is help students discover or uncover for themselves. And it's this sense of discovery that feels like, ooh, I found something. Even when, let's say, you might curate a bunch of resources and say, okay, explore these resources and come up with a definition for X, Y, and Z. That exploration process and finding something, even though the teachers have curated the materials for you, creates a sense of, ooh, look what I found. And then I can share it with my partner here. And then we can present our findings. There's a sense of discovery. Another tip for bringing joy into the classroom is to find a connection to self. So when we think about our learners' identities, and are they able to have those identities reflected in the materials, in the curriculum? And this is, you know, multiple forms of identities. We're talking about race, language, disability. How are people with disabilities portrayed in the space? Connection to self. Another tip is connection to others. So finding what you have in common with others, working together in collective learning is a sense of joy. There's lots of resources and strategies around how to incorporate play. So play actually helps to activate joy. It's kind of that's how they work together. Movement, thinking about incorporating options related to movement also helps to increase a sense of joy. And in fact, I did not include them in these resources, but one article that I was reading last week was talking about how dance can take all forms, all forms. The most variability I've ever experienced has been in dance, because I am a dancer. I've been a dancer for, well, 4 decades, we'll put it that way. But dance can actually decrease signs of depression more than some of the drugs they prescribe. And so they were talking about different forms of movement, but dance in particular can really help to combat signs of depression and anxiety. And then the last tip that I want to highlight is this idea of shining as an expert, where students get to maybe research a topic that they're very interested in and shine as an expert creates a sense of joy. These are concrete things that we can do on an everyday basis to just spark a little more joy in the classroom. And so take a moment. I want to pause because I've shared a lot, and I want to give us a moment to chunk and chew, and think about ourselves and our own experiences. What makes you feel joyful? When have you felt joy in learning, and when have you felt joy in teaching? When have you felt joy in teaching? So take a moment. You can reflect on your own. You can share in the chat if you want to, but this is a nice time to pause and reflect on what we shared thus far. Ooh, and I just have to add, yes, love the book Unearthing Joy by Goldie Muhammad. I'm just echoing that, it's in the chat. And what's so great about the book is it even has coloring pages, and it connects to music. Like there's so many different ways to connect. Like I love coloring, but I still haven't used the coloring pages, but just the fact that they were there made me smile. It connects to music and this idea of unearthing joy, right? It's that idea of discovery. Okay, I'm gonna go back to being quiet. Let you all And thank you, Sarah. You found the trust generators. We'll add it to the resources too. Maybe Sylvia, if you get the link.
Yeah, I'd be happy to add it. That's great.
Thank you. Yes, and thank you so much for sharing these joyful moments in the chat. It's making me smile.
Making me smile too. I feel so much joy. Yeah, and I'm just seeing a lot of folks talking about that discovery moment, that aha moment, seeing that moment when things click for learners, and that, oh my gosh, that joy, that pride, that gratification, it's just so real as an educator. I love it.
Yeah, and even, just the idea of seeing students respond in a
Mm,
way that, feels authentic to them. They really do come up with the most amazing ways of perceiving the world that is, new.
yes.
Oh, I have to learn what trash ball is.
Yeah, can you all describe what trash ball is?
I don't know. I'm seeing it a lot in the chat. Maybe somebody put a link.
There we go.
All right. Yes. So, take some time for some joy, because actually taking time for joy is an investment. It is an investment that actually makes learning have a longer impact. It is not a nice to have, it is a must have. All right. So as we're continuing, as we look at going back to the guidelines now, so we continue looking at the guidelines, and we're looking at the second guideline under multiple means of engagement. It's all about sustaining effort and persistence. Sustaining effort and persistence. And this directly connects to, and so there's so many interconnections, right? This also connects to that tip for bringing joy into the classroom with connecting to others. Connecting to others also helps with sustaining effort and persistence. And so, one of the ways that we can cultivate a sense of belonging into the classroom is to include supports for peer to peer interaction, right? To not just assume one way students are all going to know how to interact and get along and kumbaya. No. What are the supports that we're providing for peer to peer interaction? And this directly relates to the consideration, foster collaboration, interdependence, and collective learning. 8.3, collaboration, interdependence, meaning we are working together, and collective learning. And so I'm going to describe for you what I have. This picture on the screen is from a classroom, the teacher I was working with. And in this classroom, the class came together to have a set of agreements for how they work as groups. And they created a mnemonic for those agreements called groups. And so in this image, there at the center is a poster that has these community agreements. The G stands for give thoughtful feedback. The R stands for respect others. The O is on task all the time. The U is about using their soft voices, because they know that they can't talk loudly when there's too many people all talking at the same time. So use soft voices. Um, uh, and then it goes all the way down to the S, which is stay with the group, because they were having trouble with people wandering off, right? So these are student generated community agreements, but this is how we're going to work together as a group. And then their structured roles. So it was a middle school science classroom. So they had the lead scientist, they had the resource manager, the reporter, and the data recorder. But they took time to define what does it mean to do at each of those roles. And so what is the lead scientist responsible for? And what you also see in this picture is there's what the lead scientist is responsible for, but then also sound bites, which are really their frames or cues for students to have dialogue with one another. So sound bites these are something that I might say if I am the lead scientist. I might say, let's hear from blank. Those are things that, did we all agree right? So there's some scaffolds and supports for if that's my role, how am I going to engage with one another? And so it's really intentional about thinking about, sometimes we just do group work, but this is a very intentional process for group work. What also is in this picture here is that each group has a lanyard that's a different color, and it has their cue card, so it has their role on it and what they're responsible for and things to say. The color coordinated lanyards here are also so that the teacher could see are people with their group. I guess staying with their group must have been a challenge. They're color coordinated, but they were trying to eliminate some barriers. And so let's also talk about community agreements, because this still continues around this idea of, so I just mentioned 8.3. 8.4 is about fostering belonging in community. And so one way to do that is to think about our community agreements. And it's not just something that we do in the beginning of the year, but it's something that we revisit, right? Something that we reflect on. Maybe we view our community agreements like touchstones. What's your touchstone you're going to hold on to today? And I wanted to share with you all some community agreements that you may or may not be familiar, although I saw some people who've done work with me before put this one in the chat earlier about always invitation, never invasion, which is super duper important. So one community agreement when we're often working with folks is this idea of always invitation, never invasion. And so even when we're thinking about welcoming identities, we're never requiring somebody. Like I've seen this before where you'll do a reflecting on identity activity and then require people to present. And you want to avoid that. Like you want to, it's always, I'm invited to share with you how I identify, but I'm not forced to, if that makes sense. So sometimes we do reflection activities or check-ins because we're trying to build community, but it's anything that people share is by invitation, not invasion. So that's important. Another community agreement that I often like to incorporate is acknowledge intent, address impact. So let's think about this for a moment. Something that often happens, people will ask me, well, I'm trying to, connect, I'm trying to understand, I'm trying to welcome identities. Is it okay to ask someone, where are you from? Is it okay to ask someone, where are you from? And here is the thing. There have been times where I've been asked, oh, where are you from? And I can tell that it's in a way to connect. So I like to travel. I especially like Caribbean carnival culture. And when I go, one of the questions is always, where are you from? Because people are looking to connect, especially those of us who identify as having come from, having been affected by the Black diaspora, right? So we recognize that, we're spread out across the globe and we can come together. But part of that coming together is, where are you from? But then I've also been asked, where are you from? Let's say when I'm traveling in Europe. And that question does not quite hit the same because I can tell when they say, oh, where are you from? They're asking me so that they can classify me and then decide how to interact with me. I can tell they're asking to find out what country am I from, and they're going to then interact with me accordingly. And that's where I'm getting a sense of invasion rather than invitation and connection. But here's the thing, they may not have meant it like that. It doesn't matter. That was the impact on me. And so a lot of times when we are confronting microaggressions, a person's response might be, but I didn't intend for it that way. I didn't mean to hurt you. Of course you didn't mean to hurt me. If you meant to hurt me, then we have psychological things that we need to discuss. But you have to listen and understand what was the impact. I can acknowledge intent, but then we need to address the impact. I know you didn't mean to hurt my feelings, but let's talk about this so we can repair the harm and grow together. Another community, oh, Sylvia, you wanted to say something?
Yes, I love this one so much because I think there are times where I've seen folks' behavior get justified because or excused, I'll say, because their intent was good and we want to assume good intentions and oh, it's of course they didn't mean it. They're trying something new, or they were trying to be inclusive in a way that was new for them, or whatever it might be. And that is all well and good. But I think a lot of times the addressing impact part gets forgotten, and we focus so much on the intent being what's important. Of course, they didn't mean harm, right? And that second piece, the addressing impact, doesn't get the attention that I think it deserves in order to actually repair the harm and have it be a learning experience for everyone involved.
Yes, because I mean, and the thing here is to recognize that this is, living is a human endeavor. And so when someone presents to you, oh, something that you said hurt me, that does not feel good, right? That does it, and guess what? It should not feel good. You should not get joy out of recognizing that you harmed somebody. So you have to take a moment and take a deep breath and not get stuck in guilt, but instead lean into empathy and listen and say, okay, I'm sorry. Please tell me more. Please help me understand, right? So that we don't continue to do damage. And that takes a lot of self-reflection and honestly just being quiet and listening. But one of the ways that we do not create a sense of belonging is when someone gets up the nerve to say, hey, this is something I experienced and it made me feel uncomfortable. And the only response is, well, I didn't mean to. That is not going to increase a sense of belonging. And so we really need to think about this idea of acknowledge intent. Okay, the more important thing is to address the impact. Also, another community agreement, this one came from my son's school, share the air. Share the air. So, so and this is for when we know, or when we are aware that we may be operating in a place of where we might have a little more power, a little more privilege, a little more voice, a little more space. We then have to reflect and say, you know what? I am going to intentionally create space for others. I am going to intentionally share the air. Yes, I could dominate the conversation. I am going to intentionally hold back, because people who are not used to necessarily being in a position of privilege will often pause. And guess what? It is okay for there to be some silence. It is okay. Let there be a pause. And because that space is necessary in order to share the air. Now, Sylvia, this is your favorite here. Be more curious than certain.
That's right. This one has just been my mantra for years at this point. And I think it really ties back to our conversation around acknowledging intent and addressing impact, because it's an opportunity, as you said, Nicole, to lean in, to listen deeply, to not get defensive or try to justify, of course, because of course it doesn't, as Nicole said, it doesn't feel good to know that you hurt someone else. And it's so easy, and I've done this myself, to get wrapped up in, oh, I was just tired, I was confused, I must have just, it was an honest mistake. I didn't know that was going to hurt you that way. But it's so important, rather than feeling certain of what the situation is from your perspective and how you perceived things, to lean in to other possibilities by being curious. Let me hear how it was for you. Let me hear what your experience was or has been in these situations. I applaud some folks are sharing their personal stories around, getting asked the where are you from question, right? That's a curiosity that's more invasion than invitation. But there are I that's so brave to share those experiences, and it's an opportunity for us to be curious and hear from you and just sit back and listen, so that we can learn from you and not assume that everyone's experience is the same, because everyone's experience is not the same.
Yes, and I'm going to add it because I think that the one you referred to is only for the hosted panelists. So I'm not going to share the name, but
Sure.
somebody mentioned that they get asked a lot, "What are you?" And I'm just going to tell everybody, don't ask that question. Don't do it. They just don't say that. This person shares that they get asked, what are you, a lot, being multiracial, and their answer is, I am human. And here's the thing, my kids get asked that too. They're actually not multiracial, but I guess we're all kind of mixed in my family. But they, but they get asked, "What are you?" And that feeling is so offensive because it makes you feel like you're not human.
Not human, yeah.
That question, "What are you?" makes you feel like you're not human. And don't say that. Instead, just get to know them as a person. Just listen. Get to know them as a person.
And I saw this
Mhm.
just really quick example too. I saw this story of a young Black woman who loves hiking and loves outdoors and being in nature. And her experience she shared was that so often she'll encounter people who are surprised by her interests, and rather than trying to get to know her more, see her as an exception to a stereotype, a preconceived notion that they have, that outdoors and being in nature is not something Black people normally do. So it's almost like they treat that as the exception. So they're really stuck in their perceived way of seeing the world, of how people of certain backgrounds or races or ethnicities act and interact with the world, rather than listening with curiosity to hear about what does she love about nature? How did she get into it? What else does she like to do, right? So there's such opportunity to sort of break down um, preconceived notions that we might have about people or what their experiences is, when we just are more curious than certain.
Yes, and then the last community agreement that I'm going to just kind of, depending on how you're doing, maybe restorative circles or, even like morning meetings or small group conversations, is one that, when you're creating and building relationships, stories stay, lessons leave, right? So we can take away the lessons, but we do want to have a sense of confidentiality when we're working in small groups, that we're not, "Oh, I'm going to tell everybody's story, tell your story to everybody else," right? Stories stay, lessons leave. So that's another one. So we just wanted to share some of these that maybe you can consider adopting in some of your work. And then when we think about emotional capacity, so that's the third guideline on our column for design for multiple means of engagement. And what's really important whenever we're engaging with other humans is to exit purposefully. Exit purposefully. This is something that people often forget when we think about creating a sense of belonging, because people will remember how you left them. Exiting purposefully can mean the end of a lesson. It can mean the end of a staff meeting, the end of a class. But people remember how something ended. Let's even just say that there's a conversation that happens among staff about a microaggression. Someone says, "Hey, this was offensive to me." And maybe that exchange doesn't go so well. Our natural reaction might be, "Okay, this is awkward. Let's just all go home now. Bye." Nope, because the last thing they're remembering is the awkward moment that we didn't work through. So you actually need to pause. You might need to say, "Let's take a deep breath." We might need to reflect a little bit, but we can talk about, okay, how can we leave in a way where everyone feels whole? And it might even be that we need to pick up and have this conversation more in depth next time or later. But you can't just leave it with, "All right, bye." You have to exit purposefully. So here are some things. Here are some potential closure prompts. So for if you're looking for ways to exit purposefully, and these really align to the consideration, promote individual and collective reflection, so guideline 9.3 or consideration 9.3. And so some closure prompts, and I did put these closure prompts in your session guidebook. So you have them if you want to be able to incorporate them. Sometimes it's handy. It's nice just to have some in your, I call them in your back pocket. So things like, what are you still curious about? What's one word that describes how you're feeling right now? And with closure prompts, it's nice for people to have a choice. It's kind of like checking out with a choice. Checking in with a choice, checking out with a choice. All right. What's one apology, appreciation, or ahaha you can share with the group? What's one celebration, one elevation? So a celebration is saying, yay, this is great. Elevation is like, ooh, we can work on this to elevate next time. But it's kind of a nice way to say glows and grows. Another one is, what's your rose? What's your thorn? Was there a muddy moment? So a muddy moment is like a point of confusion. You're just kind of like, it's kind of cloudy. Well, is there a muddy moment from today? And then one I love to use all the time is, well, I used to think and now I think, because it helps us to recognize growth. Like, you know what? I did learn something. I used to think this and now I know this. And part of building our emotional capacities, reflecting and taking a moment to think back and appreciate these are things that I've learned. And so, you can think about in your context how closure prompts might be integrated into lessons or community conversation. And these closure prompts can be integrated in a way to cultivate a sense of belonging, because the way we leave matters. It directly impacts how we come back. Do we want to come back to that space because we're remembering our last encounter when we left? So yeah, so take time to think about how can you incorporate closure prompts into your space. Oh, let's see here. Yes. Oh, thank you so much. So, Rachel shared in the chat. Thank you so much about, your 8th and 12th grade students finishing with appreciating one another. You might think they don't want to appreciate one another, but they do, because they also like hearing appreciation. They like feeling appreciated. Yeah. And so many times we think, oh, they're not going to be into it. Just try it. Just try it. All right. So another thing when we think about this idea of emotional capacity, so the new guideline 9 is emotional capacity under multiple means of engagement. When we think about emotional capacity, one of the considerations is all about empathy, practicing empathy, or employing empathy in restorative practices. And here's the thing about empathy. Everybody is empathetic, but we need to be mindful of the empathy gap. Mindful of the empathy gap. And here is what the empathy gap is. The empathy gap is our bias to feel more empathy towards people whom we perceive to be similar to us. Now, there's lots of different ways in which you can perceive similarity, lots of different identity markers, and by those same identity markers, we can also perceive there to be a difference. So this could be a relation to background, like socioeconomic background, or culture. Culture could be like even things like rural versus urban, right? It could be race, language. It could be the way in which our students act. So the students' behavior might make us feel like we can relate to them, or like we relate less to them. And ability and disability. We might perceive particular abilities and disabilities as somebody different from us. When our brains perceive someone as different from us, we naturally have an empathy gap. And it is up to us to be mindful of that gap in order to then, you really have to work hard to say, like, you know what, actually, I want to learn more about this other person whom I perceive to be different. And the more you learn about someone else, the more you realize how much we have so many human characteristics in common. And then we start to realize that we have more things in common. And that's when that empathy gap starts to melt a little bit. But our natural reaction, and you see it all the time. You see it all the time. And this is one of the biggest reasons why we have so many discrepancies in discipline referrals. because we're not perceiving all students with the same levels of empathy. And we need to be mindful of that. Mindful of that. And so in your, and I'm going to highlight, I'm going to go through the UDL design canvas, but there's a resource that talks specifically about empathy gap. So when we get to the design canvas, I'm going to share that with you. All right. So it is this empathy gap that can help being mindful of that empathy gap can help us shift from your students, these students, those students to our students. Because now we're perceiving them as our students, and that will help us be more empathetic to our learners. So I shared with you a few concrete resources, but there are several more. So in the session guidebook that you all have access to, there is a link to the UDL Design Canvas 3.0. And I introduced this last week. In the design canvas, there's a space for entering what is your goal, and then reflecting on, is this goal clear to students, meaningful, open for flexibility? Is it in support of learner agency? So if you didn't watch last week, go ahead and watch it. So we talked all about learner agency. And then you can think about what aspects of learner variability relate to the goal, what barriers exist in the lesson and the environment. And with that information in mind, the next step is to think about which guidelines might offer windows of opportunity to gain new insights and consider options. And if you were to click on welcoming interests and identities, right? So if you click on that guideline in particular, it'll take you to a resource that we call UDL Guidelines, Resources and Examples in Practice. And so we have we have descriptions for each guideline, and then concrete resources and activities for each of the considerations. And under emotional capacity, which is guideline 9, there is, when it gets to the practicing empathy consideration, there's a video specifically on the empathy gap. So if you have any doubts about whether or not you have an empathy gap, watch that video. Watch that video, because the scientists there do a very good job of explaining how every human being has an empathy gap, and it's about being mindful of it, being mindful proactively. And part of the way we are mindful of it is proactively trying to learn about, interact, even go read books, watch movies that feature people who might not be who we readily say we identify with, right? Try to expand who we consider folks that we have similarities with. And then also, speaking about videos, I did not highlight this last time. I put it in the session guidebook, but I didn't mention it. But there's a section in your section guidebook where it says like related videos. And these are just really quick, short videos to break down things like learner agency. If people don't believe, if you need to convince a colleague about finding joy in learning, they're not going to watch this whole hour-long webinar. They might watch 5 minutes. They might watch 5 minutes. Or why welcoming is a must. I didn't break down everything that I talk about in this video, but it's just a quick understanding why welcoming, not an option. You need it in order to create a sense of belonging. So those are some resources there. And then also, if you need to explore beyond this, there are some self-paced opportunities. I didn't mention this last week, and I was thinking, oh, I should have said this. So I wanted to mention it this time. One of the resources that I added is joining jumpstartpd.com. It's free network membership. It is a place for equity-minded educators looking for support, resources. We post new things every week to help just, lift one another up as we do this important work. Then there are some that do cost, but the first one is free, the free network membership. Then we do have courses around understanding UDL 3.0 concepts, like if you want to learn more about what is bias, what is identity, what does it mean to cultivate belonging. If you want to go deeper, we have that. But if you're like, I just want to put UDL into practice, I want to focus on lesson planning, I want to focus on classroom design, we have a self-paced course called Putting UDL into Action that might be of interest to you. So those are some ways to continue the learning, but we have a challenge for you. We have a challenge, and then we're about to do Q&A. So I'll answer some questions in a moment, but I wanted to explain this challenge. So our next session is in 2 weeks. And if you are up for the challenge, this is what we have for you. Identify an application opportunity for cultivating belonging. Now, there's lots of resources. You could choose to explore the resources in the session guidebook. Also think about, where can you apply this in practice? Maybe you're going to consider making space for students' interests. Maybe you're going to do that. Maybe you're going to work on increasing how you might offer check-ins with a choice. Maybe you want to focus on joy in the classroom, or co-designing community agreements, or supporting student collaboration. Maybe you like that sound bites idea and you want to incorporate that into your classroom. Maybe you want to think about how you can exit purposefully with closure prompts. And then I encourage everyone just to kind of think about, do I have any, let me reflect on my potential empathy gaps. And so if there's a student or a colleague that I might be a tad stressed in my relationship with them, maybe I should think, maybe I have an empathy gap here. Maybe I need to take time to listen from their perspective and build that bridge to gaining more empathy. And then before I take some questions, I do want to share this Maya Angelou quote, because it's, for me, when I listened to this quote, when I read it, it made my mind explode a little bit when I thought about this, because it's a different way of thinking about belonging. And Maya Angelou said, "You are only free when you realize you belong no place. You belong every place, no place at all. The price is high, the reward is great." And it's almost this idea of recognizing that I don't belong in a box, but I also belong in all the boxes. Right? I can belong everywhere and nowhere at the same time. And that's a powerful shift. But that really kind of embodies learner agency, right? That I can be all things. And the reward is great. The reward is great. Okay, so team, I'm going to pause. I don't know if there are any questions we want to consider.
We would like to take a moment and allow folks to add their questions to the chat. Sylvia's been doing a really good job at answering any questions that came in throughout this session. But if we can pause for a moment, and we'll start answering questions as soon as we see a few.
Oh, and you're welcome. I see some thank yous for that. And this webinar recording will be available too.
We will post that on the resource Padlet as soon as we could get it added to YouTube with closed captioning.
Oh, yay. Thank you, Sylvia, for adding the empathy gap video right here. Yes, and I feel like that should kind of be like mandatory viewing.
It's part of your
Yay.
invitation before next session.
Yes.
We'll add a
Yes,
question.
exactly.
About it.
Your invitation.
So we do have a few questions that are starting to come in, just to get everybody thinking in this collective conversational space. So the first question, speaking of collective learning, what ideas do you two have about how learning can be collective?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I heard this conversation that was talking about how a lot of ways when schools overemphasize, well, when the primary emphasis is grades, individual grades, that 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 doesn't necessarily leave space for collective learning. But there's so many collective learning opportunities. And one of my favorite quotes is that, I may have shared it with this group already, forgive me, but wisdom is like a baobab tree. No one person can embrace it, right? It really requires all of our multiple perspectives to really understand and to increase and gain wisdom. And so even when students are even when they're sharing, like, so as a language arts teacher, and let's say we did a close reading on a passage, creating space for everyone to be able to share in their own way their interpretation of that passage, and a lot of times students are looking for, am I saying what you want to say? Am I saying what the teacher wants? But creating space and saying, no, what is your interpretation? And then hearing the different perspectives, even that is an example of collective learning from one another. And that's where it's really important to have multiple ways in which students share, because a lot of times those classroom discuss, it's just a classroom discussion, and it's who wants to answer, and then the teacher answers. But really, right? What the collective learning would be, you know, maybe they can share orally, maybe they can share with a partner, maybe they can also share it digitally, right? So there are multiple ways, so that I like to have opportunities for every student to respond.
Right.
When I asked questions, it was a way for every student to respond, not just the one who answers.
And in some way that is a response that is engaging for them. I think too, yeah, when we do the call outs, it's often the same few students who are calling out.
Mhm.
And then that leaves that opportunity to just be passive in your learning versus active. The power of sticky notes too, right? To bring in any tools like that, even low tech tools that we may forget about because we have all this technology now. There's obviously the high tech options, but low tech, sticky notes, grab them, jot,
Mhm.
stop and jot, turn and talk.
Whiteboards are
Yeah,
also small whiteboards.
yeah. I used to buy whiteboards, and then I would just laminate a white piece of paper.
Mhm.
Great idea.
Yeah.
Yeah. That
Because
Yeah.
my whiteboards kept getting broken.
Yeah.
Or
I love
I've seen recently that you can do, there's whiteboard tables. So
Oh, yeah.
students are now able to
Yes.
jot down notes and they're thinking right on their table. So that's also super cool.
And I love
Mhm.
that the way that if we provide multiple means of participation, someone in the chat mentioned earlier, are we talking about verbal or non-engagement? And really, the answer is both, right? We're thinking about all the multiple ways students can engage, can participate, and it really opens up the opportunity for students to learn with and from each other.
Absolutely, absolutely. I
Mhm.
think as teachers, I think it's every year I would inquire with my students, how do you engage? And whatever they jotted down, I would have a running list. And every year there was something added to the list of different ways that I can be creative to allow my students to engage. And so your audience, your students are the ones with the answers. So I offer up that conversation to you to engage with your students and find out the different ways that they can collectively learn together. There's another question
Yes,
that came up in,
and
oh, go
Juliet, real
ahead.
quick before you ask that question, it kind of reminds me of Brian made a comment here about, reminded to pause and ask people what they value. So it's like, how do you
Mhm.
like to engage? What do you value? Where do you find joy? How do you find joy? Right? Like sometimes we just need to create a space for people to tell us.
Yeah.
Yeah, we got to stay curious about our kids. We
Yeah.
got to stay
And
curious about them.
they have these creative ideas. Like, what I think is a good idea is not really hip and cool with what they might think is a good idea anymore, right? So it's always good to ask.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Always lean into inquiry. Another question that I think would be good for the group, for you, Sylvia and Nicole, is how can we design without bias? And I know that's a big question. So, what are your initial thoughts? How can we design without bias?
So I love this question because I hear sometimes people talk about bias free. And the truth is, if humans are involved, there's bias. Even if AI is involved, there's bias. Actually, there's a lot of bias, a lot of bias. And so this idea of how can we design without bias is really that the aim is how do we minimize the negative impact that bias can have, right? So all human beings have bias, and in many ways, bias is what has helped us to survive because our brains need some shortcuts sometimes. But it's about recognizing when bias is a barrier. And so one of the ways in which we can do that is by co-designing, being intentional about co-designing and including multiple perspectives. Sometimes that's the student perspective, elevating student voice. One of my favorite things I love to do when we're looking at designing curriculum is having a student panel. What is their experience of the curriculum? Because I can design the best lessons for myself all by myself. But I already know the content and I'm teaching students. So,
So easy when
finding
you do
coach
that, right? It's like, I got this.
is great.
Great.
But great.
I've
I always
been
get through my lessons.
I've been that teacher. I was with a SCC class and I was like, this is the best math lesson ever. It's color coded, it's scaffolded, it's chunked, there's a video, there's interaction. And I delivered it and it fell flat as a pancake. And it was because I had designed it for me and how I think about the math, the concept we were working on. And so and I hadn't given the learners any agency or choice in how they wanted to engage with the material, respond, make meaning. And so there is that natural bias to design for ourselves, as Nicole said, that's part of being human. And I think the aspiration, the goal is A, to be mindful of what biases are coming up for us. And B, if you look at the new the UDL guidelines 3.0, address biases appears in each one of the networks. And so there are lots of ways, and if you're interested in learning more, we are doing a lot of work in this. So we have a free webinar tomorrow, but we are going to really look at how do we address biases when they do make their way in. And so we're trying to minimize that impact, as Nicole said, because you got to name it to tame it, right? You've got to grapple with it. You've got to talk about it. You have to have conversations, because simply naming it and then ignoring it doesn't minimize the impact.
I
Yeah, and
agree.
this is where
Thank you.
UDL or just designing in general is really a team sport.
Mhm.
You want to have, multiple perspectives, because that'll help us see barriers that aren't barriers for us, is because I'm listening to somebody else, and including them. But what we also want to be careful of is, I'll hear folks say, well, I'm afraid, I don't want to, I'm worried about trying something new, trying something that's unfamiliar, because I'm afraid I'm going to make a mistake. And then I break it to them. You are going to make a mistake because you're human.
Mhm.
It's about what happens when we make a mistake, recognizing that design is iterative, and don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, right? Progress over perfection.
Mhm.
So work with others, design with others, and recognize it's an iterative process. Welcome feedback.
Yeah. Striving for perfection, I also feel like is the opposite of freedom.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for that response. I think we need, as educators, we need a reminder that education should be something that's done with our students than to our students.
Yeah.
So any opportunity for us to engage with them during the learning process, we should take advantage of that.
Yeah. So earlier in today's session, I can't remember exactly how you said it, but it was just when you were talking about belonging and how students will show up. They will continuously show up if they feel a sense of belonging. And we know that we have a lot of chronic absenteeism in our state. So, what are some ideas you have for students who maybe historically have not felt a sense of belonging and they don't want to be at school and they are chronically absent for whatever reasons? What are some ways that we can start to re-engage and re-enter so that they can feel a sense of belonging?
Yeah, a couple of things. One is to be curious in a non-invasive way. So build relationships to find out, what is it that it might be creating a barrier, and figuring out how we can build a bridge to help them be more present. But I will also say that when we think about um, that sense of belonging, we want to think about, well, what are their interests, inviting them, how do they make connections, thinking about a lot of it relates to a sense of self-efficacy. Like, do they find the goals of school meaningful? And do they think that their work will actually help them get to those goals? So having conversations about goals and goal setting, and just whether or not they feel a sense of purpose in school. Also building connections with other students. connections with other students now that might get them to school, still might keep them in the bathroom for secondary schools and not in the classroom, but the connections with other students also help. So helping them find, maybe it's affinity groups, and having those kinds of opportunities for them to build connections with students. A lot of times we get so caught up in having them connect with us that we forget about they need to foster connections with their peers. That's actually going to be some of the stronger ties. Those are all parts of, clubs, clubs, affinity groups, having a sense of purpose, building something together, creating something together creates a sense of purpose, and it's a pull for students to come to school. But I was working with somebody who was working as a dean and trying to figure out like why some students were coming and weren't coming. And one student finally started coming to class, this one class, and so he asked the student, "Why did you start coming to this class?" And she was like, "Oh, I realized I could do the work." Like the teacher took some time to walk her through an assignment. She got her feedback. She was moving in the right direction, got the feedback again. And she was like, "Oh, I realized I can actually get an A here." And so sometimes there's that sense of connection and a sense of purpose and a sense of creating something together that can be a bigger driver than because I have to be here.
Yeah.
I like that. I'm trying to think of an alliteration with like purpose and presence too. Like just knowing that my presence is felt, and if I'm not here, my presence is also, my lack of presence is felt. That I'm not, interchangeable with hundreds of other students, that I am a full human being whose presence really makes a difference to this community and is a contributing part of this community.
Yeah.
And that is actually another point that it was in my head and I was trying to pull it out, and that just helped me remember what it was. It's also being very purposeful about what happens when somebody has been absent and they're coming back.
Yeah.
So a lot of chronic absenteeism happens because we're not really careful about what happens the first time they're absent.
Mm-hmm.
So when students are absent, and as a parent, it is work to catch up.
Mm-hmm.
So like when a student has been absent, you're trying to catch up on what you missed. You're trying to keep up on what is already happening.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes teachers can be not quite so empathetic, especially with the fact that you were absent because you were sick.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know about you all, but sickness these days lasts for like a week. Like kids are not just like little sick; they're like a week long sick. And then so when they're coming back, that re-entry, it's that purposeful re-entry where you work with them and say, "Okay, we missed you. Let's help you." Being more flexible with it. But they'll be like, "Oh no, you get the same number of days you were out. That's how many days you have to give it back," and you're not recognizing that you have all the other classes to work on too. So just that purposeful respect of presence, and then when you're gone, that sense of, "I'm so glad you're here, I miss you, and let's work together to help you." Re-entry is probably the wrong word, but just get back into um get back into your regular cadence of school, because it's hard to come back after you've been absent one time, and some kids get in such a hole that they can't find their way out. And so then they're like, "Well,
And I
I'm
don't
out."
know about you all, but this is also drawing huge connections for me to our approach when a student has been removed because of any behaviors or suspensions. And it's that same approach. We still want to make sure that they feel a sense of belonging and support them in that process. I am
Yes,
looking.
and the Brandy mentioned they're embarrassed, right? Like it's almost like a sense of shame, and oh, you weren't. And sometimes teachers will say things like, "Oh, well, you weren't here," and we just have
Yeah,
to be so mindful of that language.
right,
Ah,
right. Right.
Well,
I
we are nearing the end of our time together. It's almost 5 o'clock. And so we just thank you so much for joining us for this amazing session on engagement that cultivates belonging. I want to just express my deepest gratitude to our fabulous presenters, Nicole Tucker Smith and her co-presenter, Sylvia Rodriguez Douglas. You both very much raise the bar every single time, and you leave us inspired and empowered to do better by our students. Thank you to our attendees for elevating the chat and the Q&A. We appreciate you for spending this time with us. You could have been anywhere, but you chose to be here, and you showed up and showed out, and we can't thank you enough. Thank you to my co-host, the SIP team, for keeping the session going and flowing. Don't forget, we have a break next week, and we will pick back up with session 3 on November 5th at 3:30, where we'll dive into representation with authentic options. Please take a few minutes to complete the survey. We're going to drop it in the chat. And if you have any friends or colleagues that you think would be interested or just need to hear more about UDL, it's not too late to register. And so please share that registration link with them. They can still attend session 3 and session 4. We will post the recorded webinar on the Padlet as soon as we have that ready. And so you should have that available to you. But we just want to, again, thank you all, and enjoy the rest of your evening, everyone. Stay safe, and we will see you for session 3 in 2 weeks.
And go experience joy. Go have some fun.